smaller so that everyone can see. Okay. I don't know what is going on with the extra marks. That's something unique too. Wait, am I on mute? No, that's me over there. Okay. Had a moment. I had a moment where I was really concerned. Okay, so thank you for joining us in person. And thank you for joining us online. If you're joining us online, this is day 2 of our discussion on inclusive teaching and learning. And I'm going to start things off today, and then I'm going to hand things over to the illustrious Kate Hoop, who's going to talk about inclusive online learning and teaching in online spaces. Yesterday, Quita Hardbostic joined us, and she talked a lot about what inclusive teaching and learning looks like, kind of from a more theoretical perspective in terms of how do we begin to rethink. Yes.
Because I teach in here every night.
Yes,
You
please
can
tell me.
take your mask off, you're behind the screen. And
Oh,
you're
okay.
safe.
I'm not going to be behind the screen very long. I was going to join you guys today. Is that all right?
Do what you wish. I was just wanting to let you
No,
know.
I
Because
appreciate
it's
that.
hard for people
To
I'm
hear
doing
and
hybrid,
see.
and it's hard for people to hear you when you have
Sure.
your mask on.
Yeah, well, and as long as everyone's okay, you know, I don't care either way. It's better. But yes, okay, so I'm going to do my very best to review Quita's slides today kind of quickly, and then I'm going to go into some of the things that I want to talk to you about, and hopefully give Kate plenty of time, and then have some time for just, you know, general conversation and discussion with everyone who's online and with everyone in person. Okay, so what I want to talk to you first about is some of the kind of systemic barriers to inclusive online learning and teaching in the university. And Quita talked to us a little bit yesterday about the monocultural mindset versus the intercultural mindset. Now, obviously, what we want to be moving toward is the intercultural mindset. The idea, right, that difference can be explored. Hi, come on in.
Hi, sorry.
That's okay. I feel like I'm saying it like, so monocultural mindset is right, that singular cultural mindset, like my culture is every culture, and it's not really encountering difference in the ways that we're trying to, in order to embrace diversity and difference in the classroom. Okay, so this is Quita's graphic, the intercultural development continuum, and I have a copy for you as well. And this is the link, guys, if you're joining us. If you're joining us online, this is what part of the link is going to show you. It's going to show you the intercultural development continuum. And here is one graphical explanation of it. And then there's also, so we're moving away from this monocultural mindset toward the intercultural mindset. And the graph that you see is just another visual representation where you can see this as a kind of stages that we can move through. And I'm, you know, as with all of those stages, it's usually much more complex, and there might be circling back, and you're not necessarily going to move from completely from one stage to another. But we can start with this idea of denial that we're just not really aware of differences, and we're not really working to face them. Polarization, right, you know, kind of very much us and them, judgments of others. Here's one I feel that I want to really take a moment to think about when I move into some discussion of pedagogy. And I think this is, in some ways, I would argue, kind of standard course in pedagogical development in higher ed. Minimization, the idea that, you know, our differences don't really matter, like we're all coming together as learners in a classroom, and all my students are the same because they're all starting out in the same spot, and I'm going to treat them all fairly and equally, and all the, you know, everybody has to hand a paper in exactly at this time I've designated. Everyone needs to do this amount of work. And I'm going to talk about this in a bit, because while that is cohesive with our understandings of what it means to be fair in a classroom space, it may not be the most inclusive strategy. It may not be the most respectful and responsive to difference, right? You've all seen probably the meme on social media where everyone's looking over a fence, you know, and there's a shorter person and a taller person, and they're getting the exact same step stool. And of course, the shorter person still can't see over the fence. So like the idea that if I treat everybody equally, that's the same as being equitable. And, you know, I come at this from like parenting, you know, I can treat my kids differently, but I'm still treating them equitably because I'm giving them what they need based on my assessment of their differences and trying to be a more inclusive parent. And so thinking in those terms when we approach the classroom. And then, of course, the model here, the gold star, you want to get down to adaptation, where you understand and you're acting on your understanding. The difference between acceptance and adaptation is acceptance is like you recognize that there are all these differences and we need to work toward inclusive models. We're not necessarily always acting accordingly, or we're not necessarily even sure of what to do, right? So we're going to talk about these two kind of the acceptance and adaptation, and I'm really going to talk about and focus on pedagogical strategies. Like I said yesterday, Quita obviously is the expert of inclusivity and diversity writ large, and what I'm bringing to the table is the pedagogical adaptation exploration of inclusive teaching and learning. And so how do we actually do this stuff that we say we're committed to, that we know we should be doing, but how do we actually enact that in the classroom spaces? Okay, so here I'm gonna say, do you want me, like, yes, no, please.
We're happy.
Okay, I'm just making sure, I'll stay far away from everybody.
We're all vaccinated.
Okay, yes,
I have no friends and I see no one.
You see no one.
That's my student.
Well, you're the one closest to me, so there we go. Okay, so what I want to talk to you a little bit then about is what are some inclusive pedagogical strategies? So when I am, you know, thinking about my own teaching, when I'm working with other teachers, and, you know, in this role in the CTL, but also in my, you know, other roles here on campus, I've always worked with teachers and professional development and teacher development. Typically, right, it's much easier for us to see and recognize when our curriculum, our content is not diverse. And we all, I would say, you know, generally speaking, recognize, hey, come on in. No, you're welcome to join us. And there's pizza out in the lobby, so we'd like some of that. But we can recognize that we should be including a variety of voices. So right in my own field, in English, you know, long are the days where we're only studying dead white men, that we recognize that we need to have other voices, you know, inclusive voices of gender and sexuality, and other marginalized, maybe even indigenous voices. So it's easier to kind of see that. Sometimes though it's more difficult to talk about, well, if we can recognize that diversity and difference is important to be acknowledged in content, what does that mean about course design and execution? That can we be teaching in the exact same ways that we have been taught, because we often, you know, mimic those same ways, and do the very best we can in terms of inclusivity and diversity. So that's why I say, right, teaching inclusively requires some intentional effort to think about how to provide students agency and access to their learning. And that's going to look a little bit different depending on, you know, what your students look like and what your course makeup is. So, you know, when I was looking through some of my notes with inclusive teaching to think about today's fossil, something struck me, a definition that I ran across struck me as inclusive teaching refers to pedagogy that strives to serve the needs of all students, regardless of background or identity, and support their engagement with subject material. And I would actually change that and say it's not regardless to background, right? Because that's more of that minimization model if we're going to Quita's slides. But the idea that we're seeking to serve the needs of all students with respect to their differences and their diversity. So why do certain students participate more frequently in your classes? Why do certain students seem to have fewer problems with your assignments than other students? How are students' identities impacting the ways that they engage in class? how quiet or loud they are, how good they are with group work, how good they are with independent work. How might you redesign some of the aspects of your courses to promote more inclusive engagement and agency among your students? And everything I'm saying here, right, it's really easy to feel like, well, great, now I gotta go like redesign everything. And that's really not my point. My point is simply to give you some things to chew on and brainstorm about. And it's small steps, right? So we're all at different spots. Try something new this semester. If it works, great. If it doesn't, dump it. If it works, great. Add a new thing the following semester. I'm always changing things up. Even if some of my content remains the same, I'm always changing up my execution, my assignments, my projects. And of course, our students are always changing. And I'm going to talk about that too, and kind of some of the recent changes that we really need to think about. Okay, so we got like an ad here from like, anyway, what I'm trying to really get at then is my focus is really on people and the idea that, you know, what the classroom experience is a relationship building experience. And so we're trying to build relationships with our students, they're trying to build relationships with each other. These relationships by definition are supposed to kind of mimic the relationships they're going to have in professional worlds, because like college is a pre-professional environment. So we're, you know, supposedly training them to learn how to deal with these things in future life experiences. So we can all kind of play this buffering role model for our students, whereby we're showing them and helping them to engage in difference and to recognize their own and to recognize others, so that when they're released into the world, not that they're already not, but you get my drift, that when they're fully released into the world, and they fly like birds, that they have already encountered some of this and they already know, for instance, you know, what works best for them in terms of group work assignments. Okay, I am trying not to take up too much time, so I'm gonna make sure I give enough to Kate. Okay, so I already talked about bullet point 1, right? That learning begins with engagement, and engagement begins with feeling safe. So your students aren't going to engage in your classes if they don't feel safe, if they don't feel like, if they feel minimized, for instance, if they don't feel like you're respecting their difference. And that really goes to a sense of belonging. And I'm going to talk about how ways that you can cultivate a sense of belonging in your classes with your students. And I also want to talk about the asset versus deficit model. And so this is on the flip side of the handout. Maybe the handout. On the flip side of the handout, so guys online, it would be the second page of your handout link. And you know, higher education in general is very much built on a deficit model. You know, that students don't have content, we need to sort of fill them up with things, or they don't have skills and we need to sort of fill them up with content and skills they don't have. And they're going to, these are the, you know, learning outcomes of our classes that many of us articulate, you know, goals, not only because we have to on our syllabi, but because we want to. We want students to learn certain things and take away certain course objectives from our classes. A conversation we have less is, what are students' incomes? And what are they bringing into the course, because you're not filling an empty vessel. The example that I gave yesterday is, and I'm going to repeat it because it just came to me, but it was a pretty good one. You know, how you're coming into that classroom or learning experience is going to shape the entire experience. For instance, through Shepherd, in order to drive a university vehicle, and I'm sure some of you had this lovely experience, I had to go through the AARP training. And I'm not quite there yet in terms of age. And I thought that the whole training was very interesting. And, you know, there was a lot of moments where I was like, they're not talking to me as their audience, right? Like, they have no idea what my experiences are. Like, they're like, sometimes it helps if you stretch your ankles out before you get in your vehicle. And I'm like, listen, man, I lift weights regularly. I do CrossFit. Like, I think my ankles are okay. Like, I don't think I need to stretch before I drive. I think I jump in that car, you know. And it's a silly, funny example, but our students are also coming in with experiences, and if we're treating them like they're the AARP driver training course, where they don't have those experiences, they're not being asked to validate them, they're not being asked to reflect on them, then they might have the same experience of our classes that I had of the AARP training, right? Like, what does this doesn't pertain to me, this isn't built for me, I'm not the right audience here. So really thinking about, and the deficit train or habit and mindset Look at 4A under deficit, it's the first column under orientation. All students must conform to traditional school culture and teaching approaches. And I will like raise my hand and call myself out and say there have been way too many moments in my teaching career and even probably in my current policies on my syllabi and in my classes where I'm really trying hard to make students conform to things like deadlines and things like, you know, cultural mindsets and ways of thinking that, you know, well, you can't do it this way, right? You have to peer review, you have to draft, you can't use contractions in your writing, or you have to get it in, or you get a 0, or, you know, whatever the case may be. It encourages us anyway to think about and to question our assumptions. If this is deficit thinking, how can we move more toward asset thinking in our classes? Okay. Oh, and I was gonna say too that this seems ever the more important as we begin to work through the trauma that all of us are facing with COVID. Inclusive pedagogy has always been important, but certainly it's very connected to trauma-based pedagogy, which is something else I'm interested in. And the idea that we're all bringing these stressors into class, it's going to change our relationships, change the way that we work with one another, and certainly change our receptivity to learning. You know, at the beginning of the pandemic, I'm like, who cares about teaching? I'm gonna die, you know, like, I don't know, like I was worrying about all these huge, big things. So of course, these things are important to acknowledge and to recognize that our students are just not the same as they were 18 plus months ago, and neither are we. So I just want to kind of conclude my part, and then I'll shift over to Kate by talking through just a couple strategies and more specific concretes of things that you can do, and then Kate's going to be even more concrete and specific than me, so kind of moving toward the really specific as we talk today. Okay, so number one would be engage difference. This is what I've already talked about, that we're doing a pretty good job in terms of, you know, diversifying our content and incorporating different voices and viewpoints potentially into our courses. And, you know, of course we can continue to improve upon that. But what about also doing things, and I say the do statement right there is be identity conscious. So you see the blue is kind of the takeaway for each of these. And be identity conscious, not just for the content, but also in terms of your learners. So can you, for instance, take a survey of your students? I do this in my courses at the beginning of the semester and ask them who they are as learners. I often will ask questions about, you know, how do you define yourself as a writer? Well, and also more generally as a student, what do you think is going to be the most challenging aspect of this course for you? What are your strengths? What are other things I should know about you? You know, and I'll get random stuff like, I'm a farmer, or, you know, really interesting things that will absolutely shape the way that they're receiving information in my course and digesting it. But then right now too, you know, what's your access to technology, and are you using your phone? Do you have a laptop? You know, are you only going online when you're on campus? Your pronouns, all those things are really important, and then responding to them, right? So Brightspace is really nice, and I don't want to step on Kate's toes here at all, but I had my students hand those in through Brightspace this year. Usually I send individual emails to my students, which takes forever. It was so much nicer in Brightspace because you have the audio feedback, and now you're limited to 1 minute, but that means you're limited to 1 minute, so you can rejoice. And so I just talked really fast, which is not necessarily the best pedagogical strategy, but I just went for it. And the one thing about me is I can talk fast, but I also articulate really well, so usually people can still understand what I'm saying. So I responded to each and every single one of my students, and that created a bond and created a sense of belonging with my students from the beginning. And I think I skipped over this in my first slide, but it connects to number 2 and prioritize belonging. Part of prioritizing belonging, if I were to reduce everything I'm talking to you today into one little slogan, it would be believe students and believe in students. And that's not terribly profound, and it might sound a little soft, but if you start to question course policies and course design and execution from that perspective of, does this believe students, does it believe in students, you're gonna see some red flags, right? Like for instance, when things are due. And I'm not here telling you you should never have a hard and fast deadline on anything, because of course there are hard and fast deadlines in the real world. But one of the first things for me to cut, especially through COVID and understanding trauma and trauma-based pedagogy as, connected to inclusive teaching and learning, was, hard and fast deadlines. And so building in to my course, for instance, one free extension for every student, which I would have normally done anyway. Like if I always say, if I have a problem, come to me and talk to me. But one free, no questions asked extension. So they do not have to provide me an explanation. They do not have to tell me I was sick, my grandma's in the hospital dying of cancer, like whatever. I don't need to know those details, and some students don't feel comfortable sharing them. Some students do, but giving them the option that they don't actually have to tell me why, they can just cash in on that. And I'll tell you that I've had students disclose at the end of the semester, like I didn't know what I was, like, okay, get your extension, just let me know. And then I had students writing in final course reflections, like these ridiculous, like heartbreaking drama stories of like when they cashed in their extension. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, if I had known that, I'd give you more than just a couple days of an extension, because normally stuff is due Thursday at midnight, and my free no questions asked extension takes Sunday at midnight. But so that idea that, like I'm believing that students need that time and that they're taking it seriously, that extension, for instance. Be relational, right? Try to cultivate those relationships with students, but also things like writing reading groups that put them in learning pods, and there maybe are consistent. I mean, many of us do Google kind of classes, but a lot of times it's kind of just like, you. Especially right now, I feel with COVID, students are having a harder time connecting, not only with us, but with each other. Masks don't help. So I have put students into like more kind of permanent learning pods for the semester. And I'm asking them to be writing buddies to help each other out. And it's really hard for students, and I tell this to my students, I'm very explicit, right? Like it's hard for you to get to know a classroom full of 20 people, but you could get to know 5 of your people super, super well. And maybe they're not the 5 you would have chosen because I chose them for you, but they're going to be your first line of defense for the class. Trying to also connect with students in ways that they'll take advantage of it. For instance, students will tell you they don't want to email, like they don't email anymore. That's generational thing. Apparently I'm old because I email. So setting up potentially other ways of communicating with them. I use Slack, which is like a social media messaging app that a lot of businesses use. But you don't have to use that. You can also have a forum and Brightspace. There's so many other ways that you can allow students to get a hold of you. And then, maybe they'll actually find the answers they need and come to you when they need help. Are transparent. So clearly communicating with students, being explicit. I'm trying to just hustle through because I want to make sure I have enough time for Kate, but also thinking about things like student generated projects and assessments for your classes. So some students are going to have different learning goals, and this will come with a conversation of incomes and not just course outcomes. Can you do a collaborative rubric with your students? Like what should this first assignment be focused on, or what should I be assessing your first papers on? And that might be different for every class, right? Because maybe you have a class who's just like has no idea how to, I'll take my own classes, right? How to create an argument. They don't know how to create an original argument. So they just really want to focus on that. Or maybe you have a particular student who's like, I've never been good with using a source and I don't know how to respond to a source. So can you bring them in, allow them more agency, believe them and believe in them, and give them the opportunity to prove themselves? So you could do classroom-based collaborative rubrics, you could do individual collaborative or individual rubrics for students, thinking about giving students the potential to design their own final projects or projects for a class, and allow them to define what their engagement in that class would look like. Be accessible, be proactive, structuring interactions and thinking about things like beyond student design of projects and assessments, giving students a range of group work, of individual work, allowing them to both shine in the things that they're good at and that they feel like they have a lot of strength that they can bring to your class for, but also giving them challenges as well. I mean, I just did a group project with my students, and it kind of fell apart a little bit for some of the groups, and not unexpected, especially this semester. But you know, we had a 25-minute conversation in class about the value of group work and why we need to do it and why it fails, even with our best intentions. That's a fossil for another day of group work. But the idea is that, you know, trying to, again, be explicit with them, but also create a variety of learning experiences. And then, of course, being responsive and flexible. One thing that I will say that my students this semester too, because part of our conversation, we talked about, you know, how they changed as learners through COVID. And one accessibility piece that I thought was kind of interesting, and I'm not sure what to do with it quite, but you know, all my students, even in face-to-face classes, said, you know, I love having recorded lectures and recorded classroom, like, you know, even, I mean, I don't really lecture, but just classroom discussions that are recorded. Now, we don't have this set up in all of our classrooms, so that makes it kind of hard, right? So there are some severe technology limitations we have to deal with, but that to me was interesting, right? Like that all of my students like unanimously agreed that was something that should never go away. They should always record everything in class. Because it helps them, right? It helps them to look back on those and, you know, assuming they watch them, but according to them, they do, right? So that is what I want to focus on. And then I'm gonna kind of turn things over to Kate. And then we'll come back to this if we ever have time, but. Hey, Kate.
I will go ahead and share my screen. And for those of you who have been in some of my workshops or taken the online course, you're going to know about some of these things, but we'll go for it anyway. So this concept is from Michelle Pacansky Brock, and she has this concept. She's an educator in California and talks a lot about humanizing online classes specifically, but what we're going to talk about today is applicable to both online classes, face-to-face classes, hybrid classes. It doesn't matter what it is, but the bottom line, it's building everything that Chrissy said, but building that trust and building those relationships and basically letting students know that you are there to support them. You know, everyone is welcome. We all bring a different set of experiences to the table, and we're going to recognize that in class. And it's inclusive in that everyone feels safe and supported, bringing to the table who they are. So there are some things that you can adopt tomorrow, and that's what this presentation is going to focus on. Okay, so again, it's all about that sense of belonging for students, and do they feel safe in your class? Do they feel like they belong? And there's some really important touch points, specifically about a week or two before the semester starts, where students can have their anxieties rise, and they might think, I don't know what I'm thinking. I don't belong here. I can't do this. And class hasn't even started yet. They haven't even seen your syllabus. So it's a good time at that touch point to make an initial contact. And I know that a lot of people send out that welcome email initially, and then you might send a copy of your syllabus. What I recommend you do is what Brock talks about, and it is the use of a liquid syllabus. And I don't want to, I think the name is a little misleading, but it's liquid in that it looks good on any device. And so it's not meant to send them a Word doc or a PDF. You basically build a one-page website. And for all of you in attendance today, I know that Jim Dovell has a liquid syllabus, but if you don't have one and you want me to build it for you, I'll do it, okay? But what the idea is to take the paper out of it, because you know PDFs do not look good on your phone, and to create just a simple website that gives students the nuts and bolts about your class, what they need to know in a friendly, supportive tone. So a lot of times when we talk about that deficit language, a lot of syllabi do focus on what you should not do or those deficits, whereas the language should be more supportive and to just provide information about your class as opposed to thou shall not, and please don't use capital letters. So tones are very important for that. So I'm just going to give you an example of one that I created. This is using, it's a website called Popular Me, and it's populr.me. And it's like an Adobe Spark or Google Sites. It's just filled with templates. And so just a little bit about the course, a little bit, you can do a quick video, imperfect, doesn't have to be highly produced video about who you are, a little blurb about yourself, and then just how the class works. And again, it's meant to be a touch point to remove anxieties that students may be feeling, and it's provided outside of the LMS. So before you don't want to have the barrier of an LMS where students need a password, they need to log in. And if that fails for them, then they already feel locked out and they're like, okay, I can't do this, right? And so this just helps you reach out to them to say, hey, I'm here, I got you, I'm going to support you, okay? So they want to know things about their books and how to log into Brightspace. That's the kind of information that you have. Jim, did you use your liquid syllabus for your class this fall? And we will go here. I know that a lot of people do use a self-affirming icebreaker in general. There's one here that doesn't necessarily intrude. And again, you can use this in your online class or in your face-to-face class where you ask students just to pick a favorite photo. They don't even have to be in it. And they can post the photo in the discussion board. And so even if you're face-to-face or if you have a fully online asynchronous class, students can post, you can use the discussion board and students can post their icebreaker or their picture there and then talk about why that photograph is important to them. And so they have that choice. And this helps, as you know, to build relationships, and they have the choice in what they show, because we know that some students are just more private than others. And, so they can fully participate and have some control over what they share with their classmates. But again, you're building relationships, building that trust, getting to know them and where they're coming from with that activity. I do have a get to know you survey, and these are things where I'm going to put the link in the chat, and that's a link to a template for it. And you can use it if you want. And again, this is from Michelle Brock. She's the author of it, but it's just basically asking, is there anything that I need to know? Are you working more than 20 hours a week? Are you the caretaker of someone at home? It's questions like that. Hey, I might want to use audio or video to grade your papers in Brightspace. Is that okay? Or do you want written comments? And you can add any questions that you want. But again, it's getting to know students and making that effort to see where they're coming from and what they need. By the way, there is a survey tool in Brightspace. The one from this link is just using Microsoft Forms, which is very easy to do, and you have access to Microsoft Forms as well. It's located in the MS365 suite. So if you click on that waffle up in the top left-hand corner when you're checking your email, it's Forms is one of the pieces of software there that you can use, one of the apps. Okay. There's also something called a wisdom wall, which I like a whole lot. And this comes toward the end of the semester where students can write pieces of advice, and they give advice about the class or about projects or whatever it is on how to get through the class successfully. And if you could have them record these or have written notes, it could be on a shared Google Doc, however you want them to share it. But that can be really helpful for students to say, okay, they could do it, so can I. I see myself in these students who were here before me, I can do it too. And so it really helps facilitate that sense of belonging. And then it also helps the current students really think about the learning that they've done in your class and to process it a little bit. And then it's a great reflection. And it, a series of videos could be really good for that. So students could use if they're open to it, again, choice is really important, but if they're open to using the video note tool in Brightspace, again, whether it's a face-to-face class or an online class, students could use that video tool, and then people can, get advice from a talking head, right? Then next we have micro lectures, which are just really key, short 2 to 3 minute videos targeting subjects in your classes, whether it's online or face to face, but just 2 to 3 minute videos that you produce that really might target on a sticking point that in your class that typically students have trouble learning. Your videos can be imperfect, but it just helps to incorporate your presence if you're teaching in an online class. And again, it conveys, I want to help you learn, I'm here. It creates that, it's an inclusive practice because you're bringing everyone in and you're not trying to weed people out, right? Bumper videos are similar in that, and there really isn't a huge difference in the way you would produce them, but they cover tough topics and concepts. And both of these videos, as I said, just really address the be present, and this is really applicable in an online class where you automatically have it by meeting Monday, Wednesday, and Friday in a face-to-face class, but little ways in a fully asynchronous class for your face to be in Brightspace so that students can see it and get to know you is really important. And so even if it's a video note at the start of a weekly module to let them know what they're going to be doing or what they should have gotten from the previous module, all those things can add to instructor presence in the class. It's not a set it and forget it kind of mentality. With teaching online, you have to be present because we know students are more if they know you're there. And granted, you're not sharing the same space and time, but you have to be present. And which also means, writing comments in the discussion board or just letting them know that you're there. And then this last one really deals with Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, which you may have heard of in the past. And Universal Design for Learning, especially in online classes, and it's applicable to face-to-face classes as well. It's really designed, of course, so that it is effective and inclusive it works for as many people as possible, right? And so one of the things that you can do is, and this is going off of what Christy says, to try to offer choice as much as you can. And you can come up with 3 or 4 choices work for you and give students that illusion of choice, right? But maybe they don't have to write that paper. Maybe they produce a podcast. Maybe they show their learning in a different way. And the same is true with objective or subjective tests, essay tests versus multiple choice tests. We know, I think males do better on objective tests, females do better on essay. If you can provide those options for students, that would be a UDL practice, which is an inclusive practice. So I will make my offer one more time for anyone who is in this fossil today. I will definitely work with you to create a liquid syllabus if you would like to try that out. And I will stop sharing. Get back over to Christy. I think I'll stop sharing.
Sorry. I mean, really, we can have a conversation. I also have, wait a second, Kate, I think it's still sharing. Oh, there we go.
Thanks.
I have 2 activities, but we can talk about this later. And I also just have talking points too. Oh, share my screen.
Rachel Howley said she loved her students loved her liquid syllabus.
Yay! Okay, so there's talking points, but we don't have to stick to those, like, we can talk about it if you guys want. Okay, I'm gonna do this, so there you go. There we go. Perfect. You don't need to see the hamster, although I really intentionally chose the hamster just as a really silly image, by the way. So anything you guys do, anything that hard to do? I don't know. Kate gave us a bunch of really concrete ideas.
Well, you have set my mind to working, because I like to break out, I like to do a lot of different kinds of things in the class, and always lasts an hour, or an hour and 15 minutes, and so I'm using the breakout rooms in Zoom.
Yeah.
And then I'm hybrid, so I've got some of them in here and
Yeah.
some of them there. And basically, when you do the breakout rooms in Zoom, it will assign them, although I could probably go through and do that. So you said something interesting, and that is assigning them some group mates that they're gonna stay, 5 people that they'll stay with the whole semester. So that's intriguing, and you think that that's better than the variety that they might encounter by switching around a bit.
Well, so for certain things, right, like I still do group work, you know, with like you and you for, you know, classroom activities and things. The learning pods, like, you know, in my class they're called writing groups, okay, because obviously I'm teaching writing, but in your class they be called anything you want them to be. I explain them as learning pods. And so, you know, the point is to try to get to know each other in a more developed and intimate way, so that you're actually supporting the other people and getting a sense of like, oh yeah, you're not really that, you know, skilled yet at X, Y, and Z. You always seem to struggle with potato sandwiches, so I'm gonna really, when I peer review you next time, I'm gonna make sure I look for those. When you're constantly always rotating through, students don't have a chance to get to know each other. They don't have to get a chance to know each other's work, you know? It's the same thing with like, I'm sure we've all been a part of, I hope, writing groups for amongst us, you know, as professionals. And you get to know your roommates, you get to know how they think and how they write. So I think certain activities in class lend themselves well to that. I'm not saying you can't ever just do one-off group work too.
I think it's a good idea.
Yeah, but I think especially if you're trying to help students, and I'm teaching first year classes too, so trying to get students to develop community and connection amongst each other. I think it really,
And I think maybe in these COVID days.
Yeah.
It might be good to try that, so to have some consistency.
and I will say unanimously, my students love it. Like I have gotten nothing but positive. I used to do this years ago, and then I kind of stopped and I did more individual work. And then when COVID hit, I was like, we're going back to writing groups. And I, even to the point where like, I'll do peer reviews all together as a group instead of meeting with them one-on-one. They can also have the one-on-one time with me, but it just helps them to get a more communal sense of what's happening in the class, and the idea that they're not alone and that other people are struggling with some of the same issues they're struggling with. And they answer each other's questions, and you don't always have to be the one person they come to for classroom conversation and question asking.
It's worth trying.
I do a little in ecology, and I notice their groups don't start right away. But like for my assigned groups,
Oh, okay.
but there are students that naturally go into groups, the extroverts, and then there are students who don't. And then when I put them into groups that are permanent, then the ones that would never initiate getting into a group are in one. And so they're in one automatically, and then potentially they'll, you know, as a default, they get grouped and, you know, they
Yeah.
get brought into an existing
Right.
one, you know, and so I watched that happen. They're like, oh, let me get your number, and like secretly, you know, like, because I know that student would
Right.
benefit, you know, and
Right.
it's not gonna do it on their own.
Yeah,
And so that, I watch it, I mean, I don't like actively, you know, make it happen, but I watch those little
Yeah.
things.
well, and I will
Yeah.
say too, that like, sometimes I've had students who are like, oh, you guys wanna like help me with my econ paper? Cause what if we all switched out, cause you know, it's like in another class together, so they use it beyond the confines of the class, which is kind of the point, right? Like that you're creating such an inclusive, connected environment that they're pulling it beyond, you know, your motivation in the classroom.
I guess that's something that's been bugging me for 2 weeks now. And it just came up with this deadline thing that we've been talking about.
Yeah,
So, for context, my wife is also a scientist, but is non-academic. So we have very different views of this. And so we've been having these like ethical, moral talks at home about whether my job is to get them the degree or to prepare them for a life in science.
right.
Because if I feel more strongly 1 week, and maybe it's really important for sciences, maybe less for other things, I don't know. But like, I want a student to finish an assignment because it's important that they learn it and they finish it. And so the deadline sometimes is less important. But on the other end of the spectrum, my wife's a hardliner the other way, because if you don't do that in science, you'll get, if you can't meet the deadlines, you just get fired. And so, it's like, and now this just past 2 weeks has played out, like I struggle to figure out what side of the fence I should be on or not on the side of the fence, because it, like, am I making it worse
Mhm.
by doing this style of teaching that is important to me, but at the same time, am I, creating a syndrome for them that will hamper them when they get into a science career where that cannot happen. And so this past 2 weeks, and this thing that, it's like this exact thing is something I can't really figure out.
Well, and I would just, and we can have a conversation about this, but like, I would just add to that context, I think if you're thinking about it in terms of inclusive teaching and learning, you don't have to think about it as an either or predicament, right? Like it can be both and, where you have, maybe do something like, I was saying, I have a no questions asked, 1 free extension for the semester, and then after that, they can come to me and negotiate, but, so like maybe something like that. I mean, because even just thinking about my own professional activity, I mean, especially over the pandemic, I pretty much handed nothing in on time. In terms of the chapters I was writing, the reviews that I was doing, I was constantly, and I was like, so apologetic, and I'm like, at some point, I just realized, I'm like, I'm so sorry, and I was reaching out ahead of time, like, can I please have an extension on this article revision? Can I please have an extension on this, blah, 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 and everyone was super kind and nice, and, I just had this introspective moment of like, I'm a professional, I'm trying to be respected in my field and I have a decent, reputation. So like, people were willing to work with me because I was coming to them and letting them know what my needs are. Like right now I'm focused on my writing program and trying to help my teachers work through online pedagogy during COVID. I haven't had the time to do my writing that I would normally have time to do. And they got it, so like, yes, I believe your wife, like some deadlines are just deadlines. Not everybody's willing to work with you, but also taking ownership and agency for, I understand what my time is, and I understand that I'm gonna run into some issues, and so I'm gonna, contact you before the deadline and try to ask you if I can use my extension or negotiate something with you. This is one example, right? But I do think having no deadlines ever, students will also openly tell you that's actually not helpful for them. And
I
I've
did
had,
that last summer. I had a class where I had benchmarks. It's like, well, you have to complete these sections and you should be here on this day. But there was no deadlines, and it did not work at all in this class. It would have been much better if I had
deadlines.
had the deadlines, and then just if students had issues with it, and that was my purpose. I just didn't want to deal with the fact that I knew I was gonna have lots of students who were gonna miss these tight summer deadlines.
Right.
I try to just keep it, that there are deadlines, because in the real world, we have deadlines. But I try to always keep in the back of my mind, I get to know them, and I have ways, particularly at the beginning, that I do want to know what makes them tick. And they appreciate knowing about each other too, so we have a number of activities that we do that get us through that. But I just keep in the back of my mind that I'm the leader of this group, and I'm going to break my deadline for a particular student, needs it. That I think that the real gauge of a great teacher is you have to be flexible and you have to take them as individuals. But the deadlines seem to be there. I try to have a positive syllabus. There are deadlines that are there where they have, and they appreciate knowing those deadlines because that's the only way they can gauge their work, and because they got other classes besides mine that they have to do. Otherwise, they'll just postpone. stuff. But in the back of my mind, you know, I tell them to come to me if there's a problem or something, but I want to look at them all as individuals, and I'm not afraid to say, all right, well, you know, you can take a little bit more time with this. Because that's the way we also do in real life. I think that should be our guide, is how do things happen, like your comments about getting extensions. We all get extensions every once in a while. And we all, particularly when we're working with a group of people, have to, it's throwing a lot of other people off if there's several people that just can't do it at the same time. So it's always, that's the joy of being a teacher, isn't it? You're dealing with human beings and, you know, you have to be constantly making these decisions, hoping that the right decisions that you're making.
It might be a good opportunity too, to have them write and reflect in class about what the consequences would be in the real world for a scientist to miss a deadline.
Yeah, I mean, that,
So,
like,
yeah,
everyone,
it's not
that's, everything you said is good, but everything is still, everything you're still saying is still in an academic world.
Right.
All of these things.
So, I mean, what if you explain to them though, like, I'm actually giving you more flexibility than really exists in the real world because this is an academic world. So I want you to tell me what would happen in the real world if this were to be allowable.
That's, I mean, do that with extra credit. So it's like, he walked up to me as my employee and he said, you've been really crappy at your job. And I now have a raise. So I explained that, and they asked me for extra credit. And so I like that. And then them come up with it.
Kate did share in the chat too, a group charter that can be used for
Yeah.
group work to help build trust and
Yes.
hold each other accountable. And she sent a link in the chat if you guys want
Thank you,
to
Kate.
access that.
Yeah, and I mean, in the same way, like with not just the group charter, I think those are really great too, and I use this for group work, but I don't know, maybe having that conversation with students is like, the first day of class, what's our policy on late work? And you put it out and you say, in the real world, this is what happens. In academic worlds, I understand that we're still learning and growing. We know life happens, you know, have a class conversation about it, and you could even say, like, I get the trump card as a teacher, so you can't be writing in like, you know, nothing is ever due.
I teach first year students, so I also tell them like, some faculty are flexible with
Yeah.
deadlines and some are not. And
Right.
like, you know, that is the conversation that we have, so.
Well, has anybody else experienced this issue? I'm in accounting, so what I see there is, if you're not gonna get stuff done, let's say by the third or fourth week of the course, it's never gonna come together. And yet, it seems like a lot of students, certainly not most, but some students, like if they have a good reason not to do something, it's the same thing as doing it, you know, like, I had a good reason, but it's just never gonna come together. And so to keep accepting deadlines with and revisions to deadlines, when you know, okay, this is gonna result in an outcome for you. I'm not sure about the ethics of that.
I think you brought up something really interesting too, that if we aren't careful, and like, I've got a few at this point that, you know, have not turned things in, and I know that now they have all these deficits and they're digging a hole for themselves. Now, they have a lot of excuses. They're working full-time, they're doing this, they're doing that, but at some point, you know, they have to decide, maybe it would be better to, you know, take withdrawal in this class and concentrate on the other classes or something like that, but they will work themselves into kind of no man's land where they cannot get out of it. And somehow we have to